Hey guys, welcome back to the Raven's Room. Today our case brings us all the way to Upwell in Norfolk, England. The village of Upwell is actually in an area that people from Norfolk call the Fens. The Fens covers about 400,000 hectares. As you can imagine, with 400,000 hectares, it's quite vast, it's flat, it's marshy, there's some farmland there, but a lot of the areas feel deserted. It can be quite bleak, lonely, wild, but there's also a beauty to it. It has really amazing sunsets and sunrises, but it definitely does have a kind of an eerie feel. Now, the people who live in the Fens are very community based, so those guys tend to look out for each other pretty well. They all have usually quite set routines, so because it's quite an isolated place, a lot of the time neighbours can actually live quite far apart from each other, but they'll keep an eye on each other, so they usually notice if something has changed or if something unusual happens, like if there's different cars at someone's house or there's a new person in the village. It's one of those kind of areas where people know everything about everyone. Our story today brings us all the way back to 1999 in the village of Upwell in the Fens. And it was here that Janice and Constance Sheridan lived. They were a mother and daughter duo. Constance, or better known as Connie, was 70 years old and Janice was 45 years old. They were literally like two peas in a pod. They lived in quite an isolated house together, but this was perfect for them because Janice was actually a really avid dog breeder, so she absolutely loved Whippets, which are actually really, really cute dogs. Look at these little guys. They had about 27 Whippets on the property, so Janice was actually quite a successful breeder. She had bred her basically champion Whippet called Dylan, and she actually had plans to enter him into Crufts, which is like this world famous dog competition, later in the year of 1999. So she was really looking forward to this. She was really excited about it. Connie and Janice themselves, they were quite private people. They did speak to other villagers in the community, but they tended to keep themselves to themselves quite a bit. They were really protective over their home, and this was apparent because neighbours would say that when they would call over, just to stop in and say hi and just check that everything was okay, Janice would, once she heard the front door, a knock on the front door, she would actually come around from the back and meet the person at the front and speak to them there instead of opening the front door and letting them in. She used to kind of speak to them outside. So other people actually rarely went into the house. That's how private they were. As you can imagine, this kind of isolated, deserted house out in the middle of nowhere really was ideal for them. This was perfect for Janice's dog breeding and just for the privacy of what that isolated landscape had to offer. The house that they lived in was quite old, so they were actually trying to do it up as they went. They were a bit low on money. They didn't have lots of money. They did have some, so they would do the house up in bits and bobs here and there. But overall, the house, along with those Whippets, was their pride and joy. In order to earn some extra money on the side to help with all of these repairs and the upkeep of the dogs, Janice would actually work in a kennels that was situated further down the road from where they lived. And remember, when I say further down the road, that's quite a bit. It's not just a neighbour's house. It's like you probably have to get into your car to drive down to see your neighbour. The kennels that Janice was working in part-time was owned by John and Sylvia Bromley. They would say that Janice was a really hard worker. She was a good laugh. She was friendly. She was always on time. That was one thing that they really emphasized. She was always on time. If she had work at 9 o'clock, she wouldn't come at 5 wouldn't come at 5 past. She'd be on there, bang, right on at 9 o'clock. So she had really good timekeeping skills.
She'd ask me what needed doing. Generally it was the same every day because of the routine in kennels, and she'd get on with it and we'd just have a bit of a laugh and a joke as we went.
She used to help me with the kennel work and the exercising of the greyhounds. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. Never heard her say bad about anybody. She just got on with her life.
Overall, she just seemed like she was a nice person. That's how people described her. The day was Sunday, January 10th, 1999. It was a cold and bleak morning, and Janice didn't turn up for work at the kennels. Sylvia thought this was really, really strange, and she was actually quite worried because she hadn't got a phone call from Janice or anything to say why she wasn't coming in or if she was sick. And remember, in those days, there's no mobile phones, it's all house phones. So she didn't get any call from her, and she thought that was very strange. So she decided, do you know what, I'm going to actually jump into the car, drive down there, and just to make sure they're okay. So that's what she did. She got in her car, she drove down, and she's seen at the house that Janice's car was actually outside of the house. So she thought, oh, okay, she must be in there. But she thought maybe she's really sick. Maybe that's why she hasn't came to work. Maybe she just can't actually get out of bed. So Sylvia thought she would just knock on the windows, the doors, just to see if Janice would respond. And she did that, but there was no response. So she thought, okay, I'll just leave her. You know, maybe she's really sick. She doesn't probably want me hassling her. So then Sylvia got back into her car and drove back up to her house and to her kennels. And a few more hours had passed, and she still hadn't heard from Janice. And she just knew, she had this feeling, she had this niggling in her stomach that something wasn't right. So again, she got into her car and she drove down again. And this time, she seen again, the car was there, all the curtains were drawn, everything was locked up. So she started knocking and banging this time and really shouting her name.
When I realised she wasn't up, started really peering through windows, and banging on doors and actually screaming, Jan, if you're there, answer me, please.
And again, nothing. So she started peering in the windows, and she could see that there was basically loads of dog shite everywhere. And this was very strange for Janice and Connie. They would never have this in their house ever. It would never be messy like that. So when she seen that, she knew, Sylvia knew, something has gone horribly wrong here. So immediately she called the police. And she waited at the house, and the police eventually came.
2 policemen came on the scene and told us to wait where we were. And they were gone for what seemed forever to me. It was probably no more than 20 minutes, actually, but it seemed to last forever. And when they came back out, I think both officers were clearly white-faced and ashen. And I just said to him, is my friend dead in there?
And the police officers wouldn't obviously say anything because they couldn't confirm it, but they just said, you know, we can't say anything, we'll let you know if there's any updates. And then it wasn't very long after this that it was confirmed that there was 2 dead bodies found inside the house, but they still couldn't confirm who the bodies were because the family had yet to be notified. Horribly, the family actually found out that they were dead because the next day, Monday, they seen it on the news that there was 2 bodies discovered in this house, and the picture of the house was on the news, and that's how they found out that their loved ones had passed away.
It was on a Monday night we first heard. And in actual fact, we didn't hear it from anybody. It came up on the news, on the television, and it was just flashed up on there that these 2 people had been found. We then had to just get in touch with the police because they were looking for us.
When officers went to the property and forced their way in, some of the whippets were inside the house. There was quite a bad smell because obviously they'd been going to the toilet in the house. And the officers noticed that when they tried to get into the sitting room, it seemed like it was blocked. They really had to push the door. And then it became obvious once they went in that the sofa in the sitting room had actually been pushed up against the door to purposefully make it hard to actually gain access to the sitting room. Once they did gain access to the sitting room, they found Connie posed on the couch with her arms across her chest, dead. She had been stabbed 10 times in the chest and once in the abdomen. Janice had been posed on the ground with her feet up on a chair, and she had actually been stabbed 11 times and once in the middle of her back. There was absolutely no signs of a struggle, so it's very clear that whoever did it knew both women. They would never have let somebody in their house who they didn't know in the first place. That much was clear. The forensic unit were in the house for 3 whole weeks gathering evidence. So it was quite extensive in terms of the crime scene and basically like the mess that the killer had made. They were trying to gather as much evidence as they possibly could. It was clear that the killer had carefully committed and planned the murders in phases, really methodically and purposefully. Janice's feet had been bound with tape and then they were raised onto a chair. So her upper body, her back, was actually on the ground and her feet had been placed up on a chair and it had duct tape around them. Her wrists were also bound with similar duct tape and she was more or less naked. It was clear that there was a strong sexual element to the crimes. Bondage did seem to be an element because of the duct tapes. The duct tape itself appeared to be part of the posing which the killer was seeking. There was evidence that it was a masturbatory fantasy. So still a sexual crime, but more of an indirect sexual crime. The murders were definitely not rushed in any way. The killer savoured each and every moment. It's also suspected that he may have actually recorded the women in these poses. The binding of Janice suggests that either she was kept alive and her mother was murdered, or she was restrained while the killer waited for her mother to come home. Once it was then confirmed that it was indeed the bodies of Janice and Connie, then everybody in the village knew. But no one was prepared for the brutal way in which both of those women were murdered. At the time, it was actually the most brutal murders that the police in that area had ever seen. They said it was very sadistic, very calculated, planned, that the killer knew what he was doing and that he had thought about this for a while. It wasn't just a sudden random attack. There had definitely been some thought put into these murders. Police had many concerns at this point, that there was no witnesses, and secondly, the road to the house where the ladies lived was actually a dead-end road, so you could drive further down the road and there was just a couple of neighbours' houses there, but that was it. Eventually it would become a dead end. So a person going down the road would have to have a purpose to go down that road, which is another reason why they knew that this was targeted. It wasn't just random. The killer was going there with a purpose.
Today, the police sealed off Pingle Bridge, close to where the women lived. Detectives are working on the theory they were murdered.
It was also clear that because Connie and Janice were really hesitant at letting people in, that it was very, very likely that they had actually known the killer, because he or she had managed to actually get into the house to kill them, and it didn't look like there was any forced entry or anything like that. So it was all very suspicious. The family were completely racked with questions. Why? Why did someone do this? Why were they murdered? It didn't make any sense. So word started to spread around the village what had actually happened, and the villagers were terrified. They had no idea if it was completely random or if it was one of them. And the more likely option was one of them, because like we'd said earlier, Janice and Connie just didn't let anyone into their house. So it was pretty tense, and there was a lot of suspicion directed at people who knew Janice and Connie well.
So when something like this actually happens, it's scary because you don't know if it's someone in the village who's just sort of blown a fuse and just randomly killed two people, or if it's someone out there with a purpose.
The forensic unit managed to gather up some pretty important evidence, and the most probably important one was a partial fingerprint that they found near Janice's head. They also took some swabs from Janice's breasts, and then the police just had to wait patiently for the results of these. However, it would be no joy. The partial thumbprint brought back 0 hits, and the swab from Janice actually did show up something, but it was very minimal. So it showed up very, very minute traces of DNA from a man. Unfortunately, it wasn't actually enough to identify who it was. Since there was no forced entry, police do believe that the killer had been invited into the house, so they started to turn their suspicion towards the Whippet community and also the fishing community, because Janice used to actually walk the Whippets 2 or 3 times a day. And when she did this, she used to walk past a certain area of the fens where a lot of fishermen would be. But the main finger of suspicion was pointed at John Bromley. So he was the owner of the kennels that Janice worked in part-time. He was more or less the only suspect police had, and it was just solely because he lived further down the road and he had been in contact with Janice. That was it. That was literally it. There was absolutely nothing actually linking him to the crime.
And it was pretty heavy during the police questioning because they had no clues or anything, and I suppose I was the number 1 suspect. But when you're being looked at for a double murder and your whole life is put under a microscope, it's a pretty harrowing thing. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. A lot of people in the community thought it was me. Suspicions, gossip. You'd walk into a local shop or a post office or the garage, and everyone would stop speaking. And that was pretty nasty.
So obviously there was an aura of suspicion over us, and I can understand why people felt like that, because we'd been so close to Jan. Yes, and it was quite a frightening time for us.
Time was passing now, and the villagers were actually getting more and more kind of annoyed and frustrated at the police for not catching this person sooner. They wanted to be safe, they wanted to feel safe, so they'd started locking their doors at night. They thought that the village was an unsafe place to be. They were genuinely worried that the killer might strike again. This then led to the police putting up a £25,000, which in 1999 was a lot of money, a £25,000 reward for any information that leads to the capture of the killer. They also had 70 officers on the case, which is a lot for a murder investigation, again, especially in 1999. Police would also go on to do a mass fingerprinting of everyone in the area because of the partial thumbprint that they actually found at the scene. So they did this mass fingerprinting of everyone, but of course that didn't show up any luck. So again, they're back at square one, and the leads from the £25,000 reward, nothing really came of that either. However, this kind of shows the lack of police work, or good police work, is that at the start of the investigation, there actually been a couple of witnesses that came forward with information, but police were quite slow to act. A couple had actually seen what they thought was a man in a saloon car on the same road that Janice and Connie lived on, and he was coming from where their house was, from that direction, but he had a wig on, which is really strange, and Connie actually wore wigs. So it's presumed that he had actually dressed up as a woman, or as possibly Connie herself, to exit the scene. And there might be evidence that while he was there murdering the women, or afterwards, that he actually dressed up in their clothes. The other witness statement was pretty significant, and it was actually that a farmer from near to where Janice and Connie lived, his land actually bordered on their house. So one of the entrances to his farm was very near their house. And he had been down there one day and he'd seen a car parked up, and he thought that that was kind of weird because there was never cars parked anywhere in that area of the fens unless it was belonging to the people who lived in the houses. And he thought that was strange, so he memorized the number plate, and when he went home he actually wrote it down, and he'd given this to the police very early on, and the police looked up the number plate and didn't find any matches, but they thought maybe he'd memorized it incorrectly. So they had spent a couple of months looking for other number registrations that were similar or slightly different, but again, nothing popped up. Now, this is where the story gets kind of weird, in my opinion, and I think this, I don't know, this is just my guess, but it seems like this is the police covering up for their own fucking shite work. So basically, a police officer says that when he was in traffic one night, there was oncoming traffic coming towards him, and he said there was a truck in front of him and he was a little bit blinded by the light of the car coming towards him and the spray from the truck, but he seen that the registration number of the car was similar to the registration number that the farmer had given. And from this miraculous random middle of the night sighting of a car registration that just happened to be very similar to the one that the farmer gave, the next day he went into work, and then he suggested some other car registrations based on the number he'd seen the night before, and that just so happened to result in them getting a lead. And I just find that like so ridiculous. What are the chances of that happening? To me, it seems much more likely that maybe they slacked a lot on the registration, and then eventually they did get a hit, but because they'd waited so long, I think it was 3 months after the murders at this point, that there was so much pressure from the community, they had to just make up some random excuse as to why it took them so long to finally, get the lead from the registration. I don't know, what do you think? To me, that's how that seems, but maybe I'm way off.
I'm looking into the rear of this lorry with the spray coming up, and I'm aware of some headlights coming towards me. And as I watch the headlights, literally out the corner of my eye, I caught the number plate of an approaching car.
My spider sense is tingling.
It appeared on that split second to bear some resemblance to the number of the car that had been seen in Pingle Road at the time of Janice and Constance's death. The following morning I went into work and my colleague jotted down one or two variations of the number. and he did some police national computer checks on those numbers, and he wrote down a series of registered owners.
So one of the really significant leads they got from this new miraculous registration that the police had seen in a almost middle of the night miracle.
It's a Christmas miracle.
Was for a guy called Kevin Cotterell. Kevin Cotterell was 33 at the time. Kevin Cotterell was a local man, and he actually grew up in a nearby village of Pentley. He still lived with his dad, but many people would say that he was calm, charming, quiet, and overall quite mannerly. But he would always dress quite smart, but underneath it, it would kind of, he would want to present himself as in a certain way to society. But in reality, he couldn't actually ever hold down a job. He had no money. And he wasn't really, it didn't seem like he was going anywhere. His life was kind of stagnant, really. And he had actually popped up on the police database twice before. One time had been when he was in his teenage years. He had actually broken into a house in the village of where he lived. It was a different village, but he had broken into a house of a teenage girl that he, I think, maybe liked, and he masturbated over her underwear. And then he also burglared another house, and with this one he scattered women's clothes. A woman obviously lived in the house, and he scattered her clothes all around the house. That's why people think that when he was in the house with Connie and Janice, that it's likely he was wearing their clothes and walking around and wearing Connie's wigs. But it wasn't even these two things that were as significant as the fact that Kevin had been to Connie and Janice's house before. So he was actually a window salesman, and he had been to their house in 1998 trying to get the women to buy windows from him. Because Connie and Janice couldn't afford to get all of their windows and doors done at the same time, Kevin had actually persuaded them to just buy one window. So he had been there for that purpose. So he'd been there and managed to persuade them to buy one window. Immediately, once the police got this lead on Kevin, they went to his house, and they actually said it was so weird because when they drove up, they parked at the bottom of the drive, and Kevin was actually outside of the house looking down at them, waiting for them to come up. And the police officer said it was just kind of eerie, like he was just staring down at them, didn't say anything at all. The only thing he actually said was, "Can I change my slippers?" And the policemen and women just thought that was so weird that he wasn't asking like, "Oh, you know, oh my God, what are you arresting me for? This is insane. Like, I didn't do it. I'm innocent." There was none of that at all. Just, "Can I change my slippers?" Kevin was then brought to Kings Lynn police station, and that's where he was questioned. And as you can imagine, John Bromley, the owner of the kennels, was absolutely relieved to fuck when he realised that he was no longer a suspect and this other guy had been arrested, because John was completely innocent. And, you know, he'd said up till now, people in the village used to cross the street when he would come down the street, or people would stop talking when he entered, you know, the shop and things like that. And he said it was just horrible, like people thought he was a murderer, and he wasn't. Throughout the whole of the questioning, Kevin actually completely denied ever having been in the house, and he would stick with that story for quite a while. Police then went into his house to search it, and they found quite a few things. They found a bag with blood on it, they found boots and a penknife. So these were all brought in and analysed by forensics. As the interview went on, Kevin would actually get more and more arrogant. He seemed really confident that he wasn't there, even though police were pretty confident that they had their guy. But they could only hold him for 4 days. So they were desperate for some of the evidence to come back. So remember, they've got the partial thumbprint, and they have the swabs from Janice's breast that had some traces of male DNA. So as they waited for these and hoped they'd be back within the 4 days, one thing they noticed during the interviewing was that when they started to ask about a sexual motive behind the crime, Kevin, his behaviour completely changed. So he wasn't like cool, calm and confident anymore. He became visibly uncomfortable and actually withdrew from questions. So they thought that was very, very interesting. They were onto something. The more sexual based questions they asked, the more annoyed Kevin became. Although his behaviour had changed, he did still continue to deny it. And at that point in the interview, police had actually brought up that they had forensic evidence. Now, they didn't have the results back yet, but they just brought it up in the interview. And then, funnily enough, Kevin's tune changed. Then he miraculously remembered that he actually was in the house, but he said he was only in the porch area of the house. He'd never actually been inside the house. And then, during that same period of the interview, the police did actually get the forensic results back, and you guessed it, the swab that they took from Janice's breast matched Kevin, and the partial thumbprint found near Janice's head also was a match for Kevin. So, you know, his number's up. But did that stop Kevin from denying that he'd been there or committed the crime? No, he still denied it. Even with that bloody forensic evidence. Like, literally. Come on. He would go on to maintain this innocence right up until the morning of the trial. Literally the morning of the trial. So the trial had actually commenced, and Kevin and his solicitor were speaking. They were kind of mumbling back and forth. And then all of a sudden, Kevin actually pleaded guilty. So he changed his plea. And although the family were relieved, they were also like, oh no, we'll never get answers now. We'll never ever know why he decided to do that to our family members. We'll never know now. And that's pretty shit. But I think with someone like Kevin, who is obviously a psychopath, there is no answer that he could ever give that would satisfy them, because you're asking someone who doesn't have a typical frame of mind to give an answer to someone who has a typical frame of mind. It just doesn't work. And people say, oh, there was no motive for the crime, but of course there was a motive. The murder in itself is the motive, that there was enjoyment in doing the act, and that alone is the motive. I think sometimes people think that motive has to be for money, or someone cheated on you, or it's got to be something concrete, but in reality it doesn't. Otherwise serial killers wouldn't exist. So Kevin, when he pleaded guilty, he said it so blasé, as if it was like no big deal, like he didn't care. And the only reason he was obviously pleading guilty was because I'm sure his solicitor had advised him, this is not looking good, and it's very likely that you're going to be found guilty and you're going to get a much lengthier jail sentence if you don't plead guilty right now. So it was really just in self-interest and self-preservation, I would say, as to why he changed his plea. His arrogance probably made him believe that he would actually get away with it until the solicitor was able to speak some sense into him. He was jailed with a recommendation that he stay behind bars for a minimum of 20 years, which is absolute bullshit, really. Like, for 2 murders, 2 people. It's only 10 years basically per person, which is nuts. I tried to actually look up when his parole hearing would be, but there doesn't seem to be any information on it. It doesn't say that he's been released yet, and this was obviously more than 20 years ago, so I'm going to hazard a guess to say that he's probably going to be in jail for a very long time, and I highly doubt he would ever actually be granted parole, based on the savagery of the murders and the fact that he was just so blasé and was able to deny it and not show any emotion or any remorse about it. That's deeply disturbing, and that's someone who will always be a danger to women for as long as he lives. Detectives also believe that he has likely done this before, and they've actually tried to link him with other similar murders. I don't think that's actually anything that ever came of that, or they've managed to do that. But they think that it's just very rare for someone, for their very first time to murder not one person but 2 people, which is significantly harder in terms of, you know, covering up your own DNA and also managing 2 people at once. Although, you know, one of them was an old woman, so but still, I think it is quite brazen for a first murder to murder 2 people at once. It does seem likely that he's probably done it before. The view of the psychological profiler that we used is that it is very strange for anyone to progress from burglary to murder. The knife he actually used in the crimes has never been found. The forensic psychologist who was analysing Kevin is my fave, by the way. He's like the poshest person ever. He's fun to listen to. He gave some interesting insight as to how kind of Kevin operates and what his mind is like.
What tends to happen is that they live off the memory of the most recent crime, where it is clearly enacted to gratify fantasy. But sooner or later, the memory will lose its bloom, and it's time to sort of add a new one to the repertoire. The question then is, what's sooner, what's later? Well, given the forensic awareness of this particular individual, it would be when the next opportunity arose where somebody who was in a similar category, vulnerable, likely not to be found quickly, and therefore they could become the next vehicle for his fantasy. The first rule was don't say, oh, he's a nice chap, therefore let's exclude him, because quite probably it could be a complete false image that is portrayed to most people.
And that is another case in the bag. I hope the airplanes flying nearby didn't mess up a lot of the audio for that. It was really irritating. So many of them flew past as I was trying to do this. I live near a military base, so that's always fun. But thank you guys for watching, and I shall see you in the next one. Bye.